The mechanics at Espiritu Santo looked at the Corsair like it had been dragged from the bottom of the ocean. Paint peeling in long strips, engine panels held together with salvaged bolts, hydraulic lines patched with whatever tubing could be scavenged from other wrecks. The ground crew had a name for planes like that. They called them hangar queens, birds too broken to fly, too expensive to fix, destined to be stripped for parts until nothing remained but an empty shell baking under the South Pacific sun. This particular F4U Corsair had been written off by 3 different squadrons. Its landing gear malfunctioned constantly. Its engine coughed black smoke on startup. When the replacement aircraft arrived at Vella La Vella in September of 1943, nobody wanted it. Nobody except one man, a man whose reputation was almost as battered as the plane itself. Major Gregory Boyington stood in the shade of a palm tree, smoking a cigarette and studying the Corsair with an expression that gave nothing away. He was 30 years old, but looked older. Sun-scorched skin, eyes perpetually narrowed against the glare. A face that seemed carved from something harder than flesh. The other pilots called him Pappy, partly because he was ancient by fighter pilot standard, partly because of the way he carried himself, like a man who had already seen the worst the world had to offer and found it mildly disappointing. He had been a Marine Corps pilot, then a civilian mercenary flying for the Chinese against the Japanese, then a Marine again when America entered the war. He drank too much. He owed money to half the officers in the South Pacific. He had been passed over for promotions so many times that his service record read like a cautionary tale, and now he was being given command of a fighter squadron cobbled together from misfits, replacements, and pilots that other units didn't want. VM F214. The Black Sheep. They were giving him this squadron, this collection of broken men, and expecting him to make something of it. And they were giving him this plane. Boyington walked slowly around the Corsair, running his hand along the fuselage. The metal was warm under his palm, almost fevered. He could feel the imperfections, the rough patches where repairs had been made in haste, the slight warping of panels that no longer fit quite right. The propeller blades were mismatched, scavenged from 2 different aircraft. The canopy had a crack running along its edge, sealed with some kind of resin that had yellowed in the heat. This was not the gleaming war machine that appeared in recruiting posters. This was something else entirely, something real, something that had survived. And survival, Boyington understood, was its own kind of excellence. He had spent his entire life being underestimated, being written off, being told that he would never amount to anything. He recognized the same quality in this battered aircraft. The world had decided it was junk. The world was often wrong about such things. The other pilots gathered near the operations tent were less charitable in their assessment. They watched Boyington inspect the Corsair and exchanged glances that communicated everything without word. The new skipper was taking the hangar queen. Either he didn't know any better, or he knew exactly what he was doing, and they couldn't decide which possibility was more concerning. The Corsair was a monster of a plane. That much everyone agreed on. It had been designed as a carrier fighter, but the Navy had quickly decided it was too dangerous for carrier operation. The nose was so long that pilots couldn't see the deck during approach. The landing gear was tall and narrow, prone to bouncing on touchdown. The engine generated so much torque that it wanted to flip the plane sideways on takeoff if you weren't careful. Pilots called it the ensign eliminator. They called it the bent wing widowmaker. They called it a lot of things, and most of those things were not compliments. But it was also the fastest fighter in the Pacific. It could outrun anything the Japanese had. It could outdive anything. And in the hands of someone who understood it, someone who could work with its vicious tendencies rather than against them, it could be absolutely lethal. Boyington understood this because he had flown Corsairs before, back when the Marine Corps was still figuring out what to do with them. He had learned the hard way that the plane demanded respect. You couldn't muscle it around the sky like a wildcat. You couldn't treat it gently like a trainer. You had to find the edge, that narrow band of performance where the aircraft came alive, where all its brutal power could be harnessed and directed with precision. Most pilots never found that edge. They flew the Corsair cautiously, staying well within its performance envelope, treating it like a dangerous animal that might turn on them at any moment. And in doing so, they wasted everything the plane could do. Boyington had no intention of wasting anything. He had been given a squadron of rejects and a plane held together with spare parts and sheer stubbornness. He would take that impossible situation and turn it into something the Japanese would remember. Or he would die trying. At this point in his life, he wasn't entirely sure which outcome he preferred. The air war over the Solomon Islands had settled into a brutal pattern by the autumn of 1943. The Japanese still held Rabaul, a fortress base on the northern tip of New Britain that housed hundreds of aircraft and some of the most experienced pilots in the Imperial Navy. Every day, formations of bombers and fighters launched from Rabaul, heading south to strike at American positions. Every day, American fighters scrambled to intercept them. The skies over Bougainville and the surrounding islands had become a killing ground, a stretch of airspace where men died in fire and smoke and falling metal. The Japanese pilots were good. Some of them were very good. They had been fighting since the war began, since the days of Pearl Harbor and Wake Island in the Philippines. They knew every trick, every tactic, every way to gain an advantage in a dogfight. And they flew the Zero, a fighter that could turn inside anything the Americans had, that could climb faster, that could stay in the air longer. On paper, the Zero was superior to almost every American fighter except in two crucial categories. It couldn't dive as fast, and it couldn't take punishment. The Corsair, despite all its flaws, excelled at both. Boyington gathered his pilots on the evening before their first combat mission. 26 men, most of them in their early 20s, standing in a loose circle under the palm trees while the sun set over the water. Some of them had combat experience. Most did not. They looked at him with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright suspicion. They had heard the stories. Boyington the drunk, Boyington the troublemaker, Boyington the man who had been kicked out of one squadron after another until he ended up here, leading a unit that wasn't expected to last more than a few weeks. He didn't try to inspire them with speeches about duty or honor, or fighting for freedom. He had heard enough of those speeches to know they rang hollow the moment someone started shooting at you. Instead, he told them the truth. The Japanese were better trained. The Japanese had better tactics. The Japanese had been winning this war for 2 years before America even showed up. If they tried to fight the way the Japanese fought, turning and climbing and trying to outmaneuver the Zeros at low speed, they would die. All of them. But if they fought smart, if they used the Corsair's strengths and avoided its weakness, if they stayed fast and hit hard and never got drawn into a slow speed turning fight, then they might have a chance. He told them about the boom and zoom. Dive from altitude, use gravity and that massive engine to build up speed until nothing could catch you. Fire a quick burst and keep going. Never slow down. Never try to turn with a Zero. If you missed, climb back up. Regain your altitude and try again. Speed was life. Altitude was life. Everything else was negotiable. Some of the pilots nodded. Others looked uncertain. One kid, couldn't have been more than 22, raised his hand like he was in a classroom and asked what they should do if a Zero got on their tail. Boyington looked at him for a long moment before answering, "Don't let a Zero get on your tail." The kid seemed to think this was a joke and started to smile. But Boyington's expression didn't change. It wasn't a joke. It was the most important tactical advice he could give them. Don't let a Zero get on your tail. Because if you did, there was a very good chance you wouldn't be coming back. They flew their first mission the next morning, just after dawn when the air was still cool and the ocean stretched out like hammered metal beneath them. 16 Corsairs in formation, climbing through broken clouds toward their patrol sector over Kahili. The Japanese airfield at Kahili had been under siege for weeks, pounded by American bombers every time the weather allowed. But it was still operational, still launching fighters to intercept the bomber formation. And that made it the most dangerous piece of real estate in the South Pacific. Boyington flew the patched-up Corsair, the plane everyone had written off, and felt it respond to his touch like an extension of his own nervous system. The engine rumbled with power, a deep thrumming vibration that he could feel through the stick and rudder pedals. The controls were heavy, requiring constant pressure, but they were precise. When he moved the stick, the plane moved exactly where he pointed it. No sloppiness, no lag. Whatever problems this aircraft had on the ground disappeared the moment it reached altitude. The radio crackled with position reports, updates from other flights, warnings about weather moving in from the east. Boyington ignored most of it. He was watching the sky, scanning constantly, looking for the telltale glint of sunlight on metal that would give away an enemy formation. His eyes ached from the strain. The sun was brutal up here, reflecting off the clouds below, turning the whole world into a confusion of light and shadow where anything could be hiding. He had taught himself to see past the glare, to pick out the tiny inconsistencies that meant aircraft rather than birds or clouds or tricks of the light. It was a skill that couldn't be taught. You either developed it or you died, and then he saw them. Dots on the horizon, maybe 20 miles out, moving south in a ragged V formation. He keyed his radio and gave the alert, calm and matter-of-fact like he was commenting on the weather. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, estimate 30 plus. The dots resolved into aircraft as the distance closed. Zeros, a full squadron at least flying at 18,000 feet, probably headed down to intercept a bomber formation that hadn't reached the target yet. Boyington checked his altitude, 22,000 feet. Perfect. He had the advantage of height, the advantage of speed, the advantage of surprise. Everything his makeshift squadron lacked in experience could be offset by good positioning and aggressive tactics. He gave the order to attack, pushed the nose down, and felt the Corsair accelerate like it had been kicked from behind. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly. 200 knots, 250, 300. The plane began to shake, a high-frequency vibration that rattled his teeth, but it held together. The world narrowed to the gunsight and the rapidly growing shapes of the Japanese fighters below. He picked out the trailing Zero, the one slightly separated from the others, and centered it in the illuminated reticle. His thumb found the trigger on the stick. 650 caliber machine guns were mounted in the Corsair's wings, 3 on each side, and when they fired, the whole plane shuddered with recoil. He pressed the trigger and felt that shudder run through the airframe. Tracers reached out in bright arcs. The Zero seemed to stagger in midair as rounds stitched across its fuselage. Smoke poured from the engine. The canopy shattered. The plane rolled inverted and began to fall, trailing a banner of flame. Boyington didn't watch it go down. He was already pulling out of the dive, already climbing back up, using the speed he had built to regain altitude. The other Zeros had scattered, breaking formation, turning hard to meet the new threat. 2 of them were trying to climb toward him, but they were too slow. He had too much energy. He leveled off at 25,000 feet and turned back toward the fight. Below, the sky had dissolved into chaos. Corsairs and Zeros tangled together in a swirling furball, planes turning and diving and climbing in 3 dimensions, tracers crisscrossing the sky in all directions. He spotted one of his pilots in trouble, a Zero sitting on his tail, closing for the kill. Boyington rolled inverted and dove again, pushing the throttle to the stop. The Zero pilot saw him coming and tried to break off, but it was too late. Boyington fired a long burst, walking the tracers across the Zero's cockpit and wing route. The plane seemed to come apart in the air, pieces flying off in all directions, the remains tumbling away in a lazy spiral toward the ocean far below. He pulled out of the dive and climbed again, his vision graying at the edges from the G-forces, his breath coming hard. The radio was a chaos of voices, pilots calling out targets and threats and positions. He tried to make sense of it, tried to maintain some kind of situational awareness, but it was impossible. Air combat was always like this once the shooting started. All your careful plans and tactics dissolved into confusion and instinct and split-second decisions. You survived by staying fast, by keeping your head moving, by never fixating on any one target long enough to lose track of what else was happening around you. He saw another Zero ahead, diving away from a Corsair that had overshot. He turned toward it, cut the angle, fired from extreme range, and watched his tracers fall short. The Zero pulled up hard into a climbing turn, trying to force a turning fight. Boyington didn't take the bait. He kept his speed, climbed away, reset for another pass. Patience, discipline. Never give the enemy what he wants. The fight lasted maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. When it was over, the sky was empty except for Corsairs reassembling into formation. Boyington counted his planes. 15, 1 missing. He called over the radio, got no answer. Either the pilot had gone down, or his radio was out. They would find out which when they got back to base. He took one last look around, scanning for threats, then gave the order to head home. The flight back was quiet. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving exhaustion and a strange kind of emptiness. He ran through the fight in his mind, trying to remember every detail, analyzing his decisions, looking for mistakes. He had gotten 2 confirmed kills. Maybe 3, if that last Zero had gone down after he lost sight of it. But someone from his squadron was missing. Maybe dead. Maybe floating in the ocean, waiting for rescue. The math of air combat was brutal and unforgiving. You traded lives for lives and tried not to think too hard about what that meant. They landed at Vella La Vella in the early afternoon heat. The missing pilot came back 2 hours later, his plane shot up but still flying, limping home on a damaged engine. He had gotten separated during the fight, spent 30 minutes evading Zeros, finally managed to shake them and make it back. Everyone gathered around to hear the story, to congratulate him on his survival, to inspect the damage to his aircraft. Boyington stood apart, smoking a cigarette, watching. He didn't join in the celebration. He was thinking about what came next. They had bloodied the Japanese, no question. But the Japanese were still there, still flying out of Rabaul, still sending formations south every single day. Tomorrow they would do this again, and the day after, and the day after that, until either the Japanese stopped coming or there were no more Corsairs left to meet them. The missions blurred together after a while. Dawn patrols over Bougainville, afternoon scrambles to intercept bomber formations, escort missions for the lumbering liberators and Mitchells that pounded Japanese positions day after day. Each mission followed the same basic pattern. Take off, climb to altitude, find the enemy, attack from above, climb back up, repeat until you ran out of fuel or ammunition or targets. Boyington flew the battered Corsair on every mission. The ground crew patched it up between flights, replacing damaged panels, fixing hydraulic leaks, addressing the endless list of mechanical problems that plagued the aircraft. They worked through the night sometimes, welding by lamplight, fabricating parts from scrap metal because proper replacements weren't available. The plane should have been grounded a dozen times over, but it kept flying, and Boyington kept killing. His score climbed steadily. 4 confirmed, 6 confirmed, 10 confirmed. The numbers became a kind of obsession, not because he cared about personal glory, but because each number represented a Japanese pilot who wouldn't be shooting at his men. Every 0 he destroyed was one less threat, one less variable in the deadly equation of air combat. The other pilots started to watch him, to study his tactics, to imitate the way he flew. He made it look simple. Dive fast, shoot accurately, climb away before the enemy could react. But simple didn't mean easy. The Corsair demanded constant attention, constant adjustment. The engine overheated if you pushed it too hard. The guns jammed if you fired too long. The plane wanted to snap into a spin if you pulled too hard on the stick at high speed. You had to understand all of these things instinctively, had to feel them in your bones, or you would make a mistake, and mistakes were fatal. By mid-October, VMF 214 had become one of the most effective fighter squadrons in the South Pacific. They were flying more missions than anyone else, shooting down more enemy aircraft than anyone else, developing a reputation that spread through the theater like wildfire. The Black Sheep. Pappy Boyington's misfits. The squadron that wasn't supposed to amount to anything. And at the center of it all was that patched-up Corsair, the plane held together with salvaged parts and stubborn refusal to quit. Other pilots started asking to fly it, curious to see what made it special. Boyington always refused. The plane was his. He understood its quirks and temperament. He knew exactly how hard he could push it before something broke, and it understood him in return, responding to his touch in ways that defied mechanical explanation. There was a bond there, between pilot and machine, forged in the crucible of combat and maintained through sheer willpower. They ran into the Japanese ace formation on a gray morning in late October. Boyington was leading 8 Corsairs on a sweep over Bougainville when his wingman spotted them first. A formation of Zeros climbing up from the south, maybe a dozen planes in tight formation, flying with the kind of precision that immediately marked them as experienced pilots, not the usual mixed bag of veterans and replacement. These were the elite, the ones who had survived years of combat, the ones who knew every trick and tactic in the book. Boyington felt his pulse quicken. This was going to be different. This wasn't going to be a quick bounce and climb away. These pilots would see him coming. They would be ready, move, and they would try to kill him. He positioned his flight carefully, climbing to gain altitude advantage, angling to put the sun behind them. Basic fighter tactics, but the basics were basic because they worked. The Zeros continued their climb, apparently unaware of the threat. Or maybe they were aware and just didn't care. Maybe they were confident enough in their abilities that they welcomed the fight. Boyington gave the attack order and pushed over into his dive, watching the airspeed build, watching the Zeros grow larger in his gun sight. And then the Japanese formation broke apart like an explosion, every plane going in a different direction, and he knew he had been suckered. They had known he was there. They had been waiting for him, and now the trap was sprung. The sky erupted into violence. Zeros came at him from 3 directions, tracers slashing through the space where his Corsair had been a second earlier. He broke hard left, pulling G-forces that crushed him down into his seat, narrowed his vision to a tunnel, made his arms feel like lead weights. The Corsair groaned under the strain, metal flexing, rivets popping somewhere in the airframe. He rolled inverted and pulled through, converting his dive into a climbing spiral, bleeding off speed but gaining separation. A Zero flashed past, so close he could see the pilot's face, a blur of leather helmet and oxygen mask. He snap-rolled right and got his nose pointed in the right direction, fired a burst that missed by yards, cursed and climbed away. The Zero pilot was turning back toward him, matching his every move, staying locked in the fight. Good pilot. Very good pilot. This was going to be hard. They circled each other, each looking for an opening, each trying to gain a positional advantage without giving one up. And the Zero could turn tighter, but Boyington was faster. Every time the Zero tried to cut inside his turn, he would accelerate away, using the Corsair's superior speed and power to open the distance. Every time he tried to line up a shot, the Zero would turn hard and spoil his deflection angle. They were evenly matched, and evenly matched fights in the air usually ended with both pilots running out of fuel or ammunition and breaking off. But Boyington didn't have time for a long stalemate. His other pilots were scattered across the sky, each fighting their own battles, and if he stayed locked in this duel too long, someone was going to die. He needed to end this quickly. He needed to do something unexpected. He broke off suddenly, diving away as if retreating, throttle to the stop, heading for the deck. The Zero pilot took the bait and followed, diving after him, probably thinking he had forced the American into a mistake. Boyington watched his airspeed climb. 400 knots, 420, 420. The Corsair was shaking like it was coming apart, the engine howling at maximum power. He waited until he was down to 8,000 feet, waited until the Zero was committed to the dive with no room to pull out, and then he yanked the stick back with everything he had. The Corsair pulled up in a brutal high G arc, the wings bending under the strain, the whole airframe shrieking in protest. Gray spots bloomed in his vision. His ears rang. He held the stick back, held it through the pain and the gray out and the certainty that he was going to pull the wings off the plane. And then he was level again, bleeding speed but alive, and the Zero was below him, unable to follow, unable to pull out of its dive in time. He rolled inverted, pulled through, dropped down on the Zero from above, and fired. The Zero exploded in a ball of orange flame. He pulled away from the fireball, climbed back up to rejoin the fight, and found it was already over. The Zeros were withdrawing, heading north, the survivors from the engagement scattered and running for home. He counted his Corsairs, all present. Some damaged, one trailing smoke from an engine hit, but all flying. They had survived. They had won. He turned toward base and led his flight home, his hands shaking on the stick, the adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion. When they landed, the ground crew gathered around his plane, staring at the damage. The wings were wrinkled where he had overstressed them. Several panels had buckled. The tail section had cracks running through the metal. The crew chief looked at him with something close to awe and asked what the hell he'd done to the plane. Boyington lit a cigarette and told him he had flown it. He had flown it. The pace was unsustainable. Everyone knew it. They were flying 2, sometimes 3 missions a day. Pilots were getting 4 or 5 hours of sleep if they were lucky. Planes were being held together with improvised repairs that wouldn't pass inspection anywhere else. The mechanics were exhausted. The pilots were exhausted, but the Japanese kept coming, and so they kept flying. Boyington's score continued to climb. 14 confirmed, 17 confirmed, 20 confirmed. The numbers stopped meaning anything. They were just marks on a piece of paper. Lines painted on the side of his Corsair's fuselage, symbols of something larger that he couldn't quite articulate. He was fighting because that was what he did. He was killing because that was what the war demanded. And he was surviving because he refused to do anything else. In early December, word came down that the squadron would be rotating out soon. They had been in combat for nearly 3 months, far longer than the usual tour. They had shot down over 100 enemy aircraft, more than any other Marine fighter squadron in a theater. They had lost planes and pilots, but nowhere near as many as they should have given the intensity of the fighting. And Boyington himself had become something of a legend, the hard-drinking misfit who had taken a squadron of rejects and turned them into killers. The brass wanted to send him back to the States, put him on a war bond tour, use him for recruiting and propaganda. He told them he would go when the squadron went, and not a day before. He flew his last combat mission on January 3rd, 1944. A fighter sweep over Rabaul, the heart of Japanese air power in the South Pacific, the most heavily defended target in the theater. Boyington was leading 16 Corsairs, looking for trouble, knowing they would find it. They spotted a formation of Zeros over the harbor, maybe 30 planes, and went after them without hesitation. The fight that followed was the most intense of the entire deployment. Zeros everywhere, turning and climbing and diving, the sky filled with planes and tracers and falling wreckage. Boyington shot down one Zero, then another. His ammunition was running low. His fuel was getting critical. He should have broken off and headed home. But there was another Zero ahead, limping along with smoke trailing from its engine, and he couldn't resist. He closed in for the kill, lined up his shot, and squeezed the trigger. His guns were empty. He had burned through his entire ammunition load without realizing it, and then something hit him. Folk. Cannon shells, slamming into his Corsair from behind, tearing through metal, destroying systems, setting the wing root on fire. He looked back and saw a Zero sitting on his tail, the pilot firing steadily, methodically destroying his plane. He tried to evade, but the controls weren't responding properly. Something was damaged, maybe the hydraulics, maybe the control linkages, maybe everything. The fire was spreading. He could feel the heat through the cockpit floor. He had seconds to decide. To stay with the plane and try to make it home, or bail out and take his chances in the water. The decision made itself. He rolled the Corsair inverted, slid back the canopy, and dropped out into the screaming wind. The parachute opened with a jolt that felt like being hit by a truck. The sudden silence was disorienting after the roar of combat. He hung in the straps, watching his Corsair spiral down toward the ocean, trailing smoke and flame, the plane that had carried him through 3 months of combat, finally meeting its end. It hit the water in a geyser of white spray and disappeared. He watched it go and felt nothing. No grief, no anger, just a kind of empty acceptance. The plane was gone. He was floating down toward enemy territory. This was how it ended. The Japanese captured him shortly after he hit the water. He would spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp, surviving on starvation rations, enduring interrogations and beatings, holding on to the belief that eventually the war would end and he would go home. But that was later. Oh. In the moment, hanging in his parachute above the steel-gray waters of the Pacific, he thought about the plane. That patched up, written off, held together with spare parts Corsair that everyone said would never fly again. He had proven them wrong. He had taken that junkyard reject and turned it into a weapon, flown it through dozens of missions, used it to shoot down 17 Japanese aircraft in less than 3 weeks at the height of his combat tour. Other pilots had flown better planes, newer planes, planes straight from the factory with all the latest modification. But Boyington had understood something they didn't. It wasn't the plane that mattered. It was what you did with it. You could take something broken and make it whole through sheer determination. You could take something everyone had given up on and turn it into something legendary. The plane had been a reflection of himself, and in a way, he had been a reflection of the plane. Two broken things that refused to quit, that found in each other a kind of terrible perfection. Years later, after the war, after the prison camps, after the medals and the book deals and the slow fade into civilian life, people would ask him about the Corsair. They wanted to know if it was true, if he had really flown a plane held together with scrap metal and salvaged parts. And he would tell them yes, it was true. Every word. And they would ask him why he had chosen that particular plane when he could have had any aircraft in the squadron. And he would smile, that hard smile that never quite reached his eyes, and tell them that he hadn't chosen the plane. The plane had chosen him. It knew what he was. It knew what he needed. And it gave him exactly that, for as long as it could until the very end. The plane was gone now, resting somewhere on the floor of the Pacific, slowly rusting away into nothing. But the legend remained. Pappy Boyington and his junkyard Corsair, the misfit pilot and the broken plane that together had written themselves into the history of the war. They had proven that excellence wasn't about starting with the best equipment or the most resources. It was about refusing to accept limitations, about finding ways to win even when everything was stacked against you. The mechanics had mocked that plane. The other pilots had avoided it. Everyone had written it off as worthless, until one man saw past the peeling paint and the malfunctioning systems and the jury-rigged repairs, saw the potential that nobody else recognized, and took that potential and forged it into something the Japanese would never forget. In the end, the plane had become exactly what Boyington needed it to be. Not perfect, not pristine, but relentless, determined, and absolutely lethal in the hands of someone who understood its nature. That was the real lesson, the one that echoed down through the decades. Never judge something by its appearance. Never assume that what looks broken is actually broken. Because sometimes the most unlikely things, the most damaged things, the things everyone else has given up on, are exactly the ones that will carry you through when everything else has failed. The plane was gone, but the truth it represented lived on, and that truth was this. They can mock what you have, doubt what you're capable of, write you off as finished before you even begin. But if you refuse to quit, if you take what you've been given and push it to its absolute limit, if you understand that sometimes broken things are the strongest things of all, then you can achieve something extraordinary. You can take scrap metal and turn it into legend. And nobody can ever take that away from you.